each and all of you. We invite you to settle and center yourselves calm and alert to whatever this day may provide. have noticed that's Robert Schumann's Entering the Forest. So you can think about that as we gather today. So let us pray for peace and the things that make for peace as we light the peace candle. And in your bulletin you'll see an acknowledgement. As Debbie lights the candle, I'll read the plain face and you read the bold face. In them was life, and the life was the light of the world.
The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it.
Welcome again, everyone. I want to acknowledge that those of you who are not here all the time may not expect to see me here, but Tom is away for 2 weeks, and I offered to preside over the service. And I was remembering in high school, I took a vocational interest survey, and it said I was most likely to be a camp director or a minister, neither of which I became. But when I had the opportunity, I jumped at it. There are some announcements in the bulletin. Oh, before I go forward, I want to acknowledge Anamika's here. We're happy to have her back. And Becky and I have done a number of programs with her, and we love doing teamwork together. There are announcements on the back of the bulletin. Are there any other announcements? Wait.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, you jumped.
There's an order. Hi, everyone. If you don't know me, my name is Kate Rymanis. I'm part of the Fulfilling Our Vision Committee, and we want to invite you all next Sunday at 3:30 that we're going to host a workshop here in the parish hall, and it's open to the whole community, the town. So if you're interested, spread the word for teens and adults. So the title, I really like it. It's Who Are We Open To and What Are We Affirming? So we're in the midst of becoming a more actively welcome church to marginalized people, or people who have been marginalized by churches. And this workshop is kind of an introductory 101 to understanding gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation. So it's going to be interactive, and all people really need to bring is like, curiosity and open mind, willingness to learn. The part I'm very excited about is our facilitator, who's Krista Worm, who's an educator at the Sharon Academy. And she's dedicated a lot of her professional development and training to issues around anti-racism, equity and inclusion. So she'll be great at leading us. Thanks.
And if you have questions about that, you can contact Kate.
This is just a short announcement. We missed somehow that last week was International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was January 27th, which is a horrifying but useful reminder of what happens when ultimately there's a lot of exclusion and discrimination and much worse than that. So just for us to take a moment just to remember that.
Now I'm going to introduce Danette, who's going to introduce our guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Apologies to Kate and Joey. Good morning. On behalf of the Mission Committee, I am thrilled and so honored to welcome Eloise Ginty today. Eloise is here today to present a mission moment about an organization that she founded called Hearts You Hold, which is a nonprofit that our church has been happy to support. I will let Eloise tell you all about Hearts You Hold, but first I just want to tell you just a tiny bit about Eloise. Eloise had a full and inspirational career in public education. After being at home for many years parenting her own 3 children, she worked at Hannah House in Lebanon, New Hampshire, teaching parenting classes to pregnant and parenting teens. She went from there to 13 years of public school teaching, which included being a teacher at the Newton School. When I met Eloise, she was my son Joel's kindergarten teacher and then his first grade teacher extraordinaire. I personally credit much of Joel's success to Eloise. I really do. I knew how special and caring she was in the very first visit to our home. I didn't know kindergarten teachers visited homes before they met children in the classroom, but Eloise did. And then I had the privilege of teaching at Newton School with Eloise as a colleague. And honestly, I admired her even more than I had before, which I didn't even think was possible. Next, Eloise spent 11 years being an elementary school principal. All I have to say is lucky kids and lucky teachers. She retired from education in 2019 and started off on a very new learning adventure by founding this nonprofit organization, Hearts You Hold. She lives in Strafford, Vermont with her husband of 38 years, and they have 3 grown children and 8 grandchildren. So welcome this morning to dear Eloise, and thank you so much for joining us. Can either speak from here or from the pulpit. Great. If I can compose myself after that introduction. My gosh, I had a lot of swirling feelings just driving from Thetford to Strafford about what an impact my time in Strafford had on me. And that then Danette just said all of that, which I wasn't expecting. So anyway, I think before I talk about Hearts You Hold, I do want to say that when I started my career teaching, it was in Strafford, and what a lucky person I was to be able to teach for 10 years in Strafford. The community, the families, the children, and the team that I worked with at the Newton School was phenomenal, and it really shaped not only my educational career, but just my way of thinking about everything. So a big part of my heart is here in Strafford for sure. Right, Joey? Right. And so anyway, I was encouraged to look into being, moving on to being principal, and I kept saying, why?
why would anybody want that job? Why? And then I started looking around at other principals, and I was like, well, if they can do it, I can probably do it. So off I went. And it was, again, just another huge learning experience for me and an honor to be able to do that. When I decided to retire, I didn't know COVID was coming. I didn't know my mother was going to be diagnosed with brain cancer and pass in 3 months. And I didn't know a lot of other things that retiring was going to be, looking back, as a good decision. And Hard to Hold was something else that came along with me deciding to retire from public education. I knew that I wanted to keep doing something that had meaning out there in the world. I was looking forward to being a grandmother and visiting all of our children, but that wasn't going to be enough for me, and I knew that about myself. And so a lot of things in my life came together for the idea for Hard to Hold. One of the major motivating factors was that there was a lot of perpetration and hate going on at that time towards immigrants, migrants, and refugees. They were being targeted, and I just, I went to a lot of rallies, I went to a lot of marches, I signed a lot of petitions, but it just didn't feel like that was going to be enough down the road for me anyway. And when I was driving back from my mother's, I spent a lot of time with her. I had all of these ideas come together at one time, and I pulled over on the side of the road and I wrote them all down, and it turned out that was Hard to Hold. And so it's been so perfect in so many ways, because it was another venture into learning for me, which has always been something that's mattered. And it was also combating the hate that was floating out there with love. And the big, seed of Hard to Hold is love. It's about love. Anyway, so yes, it's a nonprofit, and the premise of it is that we can't assume that we know what people want or need. A lot of nonprofits do amazing work. And one of them that I started working with down south, when a whole bunch of immigrants were snatched out of a chicken processing plant and put into detention, was that they provided food to families, and they told me they got boxes of macaroni and cheese and all this other stuff that was really thoughtful and kind and would get eaten, but it wasn't the type of food that those families ate or even would be comforting to them. And so Hard to Hold works with connecting organizations and volunteers to ask the recipients what they want or need. And it's time consuming to do that, to sit down and talk to people, but these organizations and volunteers already have a trusted relationship with them, and they are doing a lot of other work that Hard to Hold doesn't do that's important, finding medical and legal and all kinds of other assistance to help them assimilate. And so those are the requests that come to the organization directly from the people through their trusted relationships, go up onto the website, and right now there's probably 30 requests on the website from immigrants, migrants, refugees, some of them locally in Vermont and New Hampshire, but they're also from a whole bunch of other states around the United States. And then people can go onto the website and read the requests, read a little bit about the person who's requesting it, and decide to fund it or not. Once they get funded, then we go ahead and send the item off to the person or wherever they want it sent. There's a lot of thought taken to people only giving as much information as they feel comfortable with. So it can be sent to the organization or directly to them or whatever makes sense. So that's what Hearts You Hold basically is all about. Started it 4 years ago, and we've funded over 1,800 requests so far. The Upper Valley has been incredibly supportive, like your church here. Once people sort of take a peek at it, they get it and understand it. Just talking to you here is harder to explain it. It's easier to see it on the website, see how it's laid out, to understand it, because it's a little bit of a different model. And the model actually came from an educational model of a company, an organization called Donors Choose, where teachers post a little bit about themselves, their classroom, what they need, and donors go on and can fund that way. And I'm like, that model has to work for other things as well. So, you know, I didn't know what I was doing. I thought, well, I'll just go find out who did Donors Choose website and get them to do mine. Turns out they have 4 full-time employees that design the website and keep the website up and going, so that was not the way it could go. But the website is modeled off of that. It's modeled off of asking people, having people post what they want or need. So there's probably a lot more I could say, but I'm happy to answer questions here or afterwards. It's a small enough group that if you're comfortable to just ask questions, I'm happy to answer any of them.
Thank you so much, Eloise. Eloise has kindly agreed to stay after doing refreshments and answer any questions. One last thing. We would like to present to you a humble donation from the United Church of Strafford Mission Committee to continue this loving, wonderful work that you're doing. And we make this donation in honor of our dear friend and longtime Mission Committee member, Martha Manheim. She was an advocate for and a champion of refugees. I think that's why she came on the Mission Committee, was to work for refugees. It was her passion. And so we make this donation to you in her honor today. Martha would be so proud of your loving work, and we are too. We also add to this donation any contributions that show up in the basket today. We welcome all of you to join us in supporting the work of Hearts You Hold by adding to our special offering today. And again, we thank you so much for joining us, Eloise, and we wish you in Hearts You Hold the very best.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eloise. I had one more announcement I just want to acknowledge. I see many of you wearing your coats. We have a bulky thermostat, so it's slowly rising, but thank you for your tolerance. So next we're going to have a responsive reading, which John Ishvaria is going to help us with. I did want to mention Joy Harjo, who we read from last week, is a Muskogee Creek indigenous poet, has been the Poet Laureate of America for the past 4 years. And I think this will directly connect with something Eloise mentioned about bringing to the hate around us love.
Bless this land from the top of its head to the bottom of its feet. Bless the eyes of this land, for they witness cruelty and kindness in this land. Bless the ears of this land, for they hear cries of heartbreak and shouts of celebration in this land. Bless the mouth, lips, and speech of this land, for the land is a speaker, a singer, a keeper of all that happens here on this land. Moonless forests, oceans, and rock cliffs, sold for the trash flood of gold, uranium, or oil, a bust rush, yet there are no stories to be made, little ones coming up over the horizon. Bless the arms and hands of this land, for they remake and restore beauty in this land. We are held in a circle around these lands by song, and reminded by the knowers that not one is over the other, no human above the bird, no bird above the insect, no wind above the grass.
So when
sometimes when Tom is there, he's very specific what he wants. So this week I got a carte blanche, which was great. I love to pick songs that fit with readings, as every minister does as well. So the music I picked today, it also, talking with Ember and Jim, this is a Kiowa prayer from the Flatlands, if I say that correctly. And the melody is used in different groups. Because of the book we're reading, Braiding, Sweetgrass, I try to immerse songs about nature and old traditions in the songs we picked today. Also, the comment that Joey made about the Holocaust, the song that the choir will sing is an anthem. I will read it now, that the rest of the service can go in the flow. It's written by friends of Peter and Mary Alice Amadon, who have been here for workshops. Maybe I should use a mic. Anyway, I think you can hear me. Harry and Edith Baron joined Bruderhof, a German-English freedom spiritual community, after they fled Nazi Germany and settled in England. World War II forced the community to move to the jungles of Paraguay, where they built their own houses, grew their own food, and sang and sang. And this couple ended up in Brattleboro, that's where the Amadons met them. But the roots of this music is based on all the people who had to flee Germany. So in a way that also surrounds your comment about last week. And then it is a blessing and a thank you for the food and what the earth is giving us. So that all linked together. I think it's going to be that's why it's always really fun to collaborate with Jim and Becky. You can, the text, that works so nicely. Anyway, so the anthem melody, maybe the hymn melody, maybe a little less familiar. So I'm going to play it a few times for you, and then the choir will stand up and help you get through it. There's no measure lines, so that means that you cannot count to 3 or 4. You just have to go with the flow, right? So we're just going with the flow. I'll play it a few times.
Enjoyable, even though we don't have children with us. It's important, I think, and I'm sure all the people who've stood here and thought about the service have enjoyed thinking, what's particular about the children's time? And so it's easy to address you as including children in yourselves. And it ripples out from there. I did want to acknowledge at the very end of the Joy Harjo poem, and this is actually only a portion of the beginning of this poem, but she says, "We were held in the circle around these lands by song," which very much is the feeling of in this room when there's song, "and reminded by the knowers that not one is over the other. No human is above the bird, no bird above the insect, no wind above the grass." Now, I'm imagining if there were a 7-year-old here, they might say, yes, but the wind is above the grass. So I just want to note that our language is approximate in many ways, but you know what she's saying, it is not more important than. So it's that sense that I think many of us have really responded to in Braiding Sweetgrass, that sense of mutuality. One of the things that Robin Wall Kimmerer says is all flourishing is mutual. And So in the spirit of the children's portion of this gathering, I wanted to mention this concept that's really important in the book. Actually, I'm going to take this off, of the honorable harvest. And the honorable harvest is the sense that of a certain amount of restraint, also the eagerness that we feel when there's this abundance around us. So there's a little quote at the top of your bulletin. Our teachings tell us to never take more than half. So I'm going to read a little piece, before reading a longer section, I'm going to read a little piece of Braiding Sweetgrass. And I wanted to start, not all of you maybe have ever seen real wild rice. Sometimes when you buy Uncle Ben's, there's a little sprinkled in. I know that John and Joey have, because they lived in Minnesota. But I'm going to pass around. You can just pass this and see it. It's amazing. It's not actually a rice. Wild rice is a grass. And it's harvested by canoes going through marshes. It's very tall. And shaking the stalks or knocking them with canoe paddles, and it falls into the canoe. And there's a funny thing that happens that someone might consider waste. It's only funny because there's these different perceptions about all the rice that falls that doesn't go in the canoe. So I'm going to read you this little piece that relates to this notion of the honorable harvest. Early colonists on Turtle Island were stunned by the plenitude they found here, attributing the richness to the bounty of nature. Settlers in the Great Lakes wrote in their journals about the extraordinary abundance of wild rice harvested by native peoples. In a few days, they could fill their canoes with enough rice to last all year. But the settlers were puzzled by the fact that, as one of them wrote, this is a quote, "The savages stopped gathering long before all the rice was harvested," unquote. She observed that, quote, "The rice harvest starts with a ceremony of thanksgiving and prayers for good weather for the next 4 days. They will harvest dawn till dusk for the prescribed 4 days and then stop, often leaving much rice to stand unreaped. This rice, they say, is not for them but for the thunders. Nothing will compel them to continue. Therefore, much goes to waste," unquote. The settlers took this as certain evidence of laziness and lack of industry on the part of the heathens. They did not understand how indigenous land care practices might contribute to the wealth they encountered. I once met an engineering student visiting from Europe who told me excitedly about going ricing in Minnesota with his friend's Ojibwa family. He was eager to experience a bit of Native American culture. They were on the lake by dawn, and all day long they poled through the rice beds, knocking the ripe seed into the canoe. Quote, "It didn't take long to collect quite a bit," he reported, "but it's not very efficient. At least half the rice just falls in the water, and they didn't seem to care. It's wasted." As a gesture of thanks to his hosts, a traditional ricing family, he offered to design a grain capture system that could be attached to the gunnels of their canoes. He sketched it out for them, showing how his technique could get 85% more rice. His hosts listened respectfully, then said, "Yes, we could get more that way, but it's got to seed itself for next year. And what we leave behind is not wasted. You know, we're not the only ones who like rice." Do you think the ducks would stop here if we took it all? Our teachings tell us to never take more than half. It's really amusing in a way and horrifying to see these two completely different ways of viewing set side by side. So let's read together from the Pew Card, the new version of the Lord's Prayer. Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, way, truth, and life, force of love and light, flowing within and all around us, may your realm of compassion, justice, and peace rule our world. Thank you for nurturing and guiding us, forgiving us and helping us forgive, and leading us away from harmful desires. Please save us from all forms of evil, for you are our source, our home, our power, all goodness and beauty forever. Now, many of you were here last week, but I'll mention again, we have 2 weeks when we're reading from this book, Braiding, Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. And what's particularly fascinating is the perspective of the author. Her lineage is Potawatomi from the middle part of the continent, what became called Indian country because federal policy was to move people from various places to this now called Oklahoma territory. She teaches at SUNY Syracuse and is a botanist, a really renowned botanist. So the book is a kind of personal quest to find a reconciliation between her scientific training, which she really embraces and celebrates, and another way of thinking about, well, in particular about plants, but very much relating to other forms of life with which we share the cosmos. And there's this notion of sentience, that a plant might be sentient, not necessarily conscious in the same way that we think about consciousness for ourselves, but responsive. You know, there are studies about playing Mozart to your houseplants and that they thrive, and greenhouses that have music playing in them. So this is what's long considered kind of fringy, and is now being explored much more earnestly and carefully. And Robin Wall Kimmerer is one of the people who is really in the forefront of this acknowledgement, partly because she's such a good storyteller. So I'm going to read you part of a chapter. Its theme is really neighborliness, but she did an interesting thing in the writing of this chapter. She uses her daughter's voice. She has 2 daughters who figure in the book, usually as characters and companions in various adventures. But in this case, it appears, I tried to see from the acknowledgement, it doesn't appear that this is actually her daughter's section of the book that her daughter wrote. It's in the voice of her daughter, and it's acknowledged as told through the eyes of my daughter. But you'll see there's a perspective that's a little bit different than what I read last week. When she refers to my mother, she's referring to Robin, the author. And it's really a chapter about a neighbor. I think many of you will think about Strafford neighbors when you hear this description of this neighbor, and a kind of knowledge that many people have lost. It's set in November, so it's a little bit earlier than now. And I did want to also mention, along with showing you wild rice, how many of you have in your medicine cabinet witch hazel? Yeah, so witch hazel is very easy to come by in any pharmacy. It's a concoction or a distillation from a plant that grows here. It's an unusual plant because it blossoms in the wintertime. Yellow blossom that you'll see in the woods. It's pretty much the only thing blossoming. And it's used for sore muscles, sore throats. It can be rubbed into your temples for headaches. It's an old remedy that somehow has survived the FDA and modern American commercialism to just be, most people have some around. November is not a time for flowers. The days short and cold. Heavy clouds drag at my mood, and sleet, like a muttered curse, propels me indoors. I'm reluctant to venture out again. So when the sun breaks through for that rare yellow day, maybe the last before the snow falls, I have to go. Because the woods are quiet this time of year, without leaves or birds. The buzz of a bee seems inordinately loud. Intrigued, I follow her path. What could bring her out in November? She makes directly for bare branches, which, when I look more closely, are strewn with yellow flowers, witch hazel. The flowers are a ragged affair, 5 long petals, each like a scrap of fading yellow cloth that's snagged on a branch, torn strips that wave in the breeze. But oh, are they welcome, a spot of color when months of gray lie ahead, a last hurrah before winter that suddenly reminds me of a November long ago. I first met Hazel Barnett when I was walking the fields in Kentucky, looking for wild blackberries with my mother. We were bent to our picking when I heard a high voice from the hedgerow call, "Howdy do, howdy do." There at the fence stood the oldest woman I'd ever seen. Slightly afraid, I took my mother's hand as we walked over to greet her. She supported herself by leaning against the fence among the pink and burgundy hollyhocks. Her iron gray hair was drawn into a bun at the back of her neck with a corona of white wisps standing out like sun rays around her toothless face. "I like to see your light at night," she said. "It feels real neighborly. I seen y'all walking out and come to say hi. My mother introduced herself, explained we'd moved in a few months ago. "And who is this little bundle of joy?" she asked, leaning over the barbed wire to pinch my cheek. The fence pressed into the loose breast of her house dress, where pink and purple flowers like the hollyhocks were fading from many washings. She wore bedroom slippers outside in the garden, something my mother would never allow. She stuck her wrinkled old hand over the fence, veiny and crooked, with a wire-thin band of gold loose on her ring finger. I'd never heard of a person named Hazel, but I'd heard of witch hazel and was quite certain that this must be the witch herself. I held my mother's hand even tighter. I suppose, given the way she is with plants, there was a time when some might have called her witch. And there is something eerie about a tree that flowers so far out of season and then spits its seeds, shiny pearls as black as midnight, 20 feet into the quiet fall woods, with a sound like an elfin footfall. She and my mother became unlikely friends, trading recipes and garden tips. By day, my mother was a professor at the college in town, sitting at her microscope, writing scientific articles. But spring twilight found her barefoot in the garden, planting beans and helping me fill my pail with earthworms that were severed by her shovel. I thought I could nurse them back to health in the worm hospital I constructed beneath the irises. She encouraged me in this, always saying, "There is no hurt that can't be healed by love." Before dark, many evenings, we would wander across the pasture to the fence and meet Hazel. "I do like to see your light in the window," she said. "There ain't nothing better than a good neighbor." I listened while they discussed putting stove ash at the base of tomato plants to keep off cutworms, or Mama bragged on how fast I was learning to read. "Lord, she is a quick study, ain't you, my little honeybee?" Hazel said. Sometimes she had a wrapped peppermint in her dress pocket for me, the cellophane old and soft around it. The visits progressed from the fence line to the front porch. When we baked, we would take over a plate of cookies and sip lemonade on her sagging stoop. I never liked to go in the house, an overwhelming jumble of old junk, trash bags, cigarette smoke, and what I now know as the smell of poverty. Hazel lived in the little shotgun house with her son Sam and daughter Janie. Janie was, as her mother explained, simple, on account of she came late in life, her mother's last child. She was kind and loving and always wanted to smother my sister and me in her deep, soft arms. Sam was disabled, couldn't work, but received some veterans' benefits and a pension from the coal company that they all lived on. Barely. When he was well enough to go fishing, he would bring us big catfish from the river. He coughed like crazy, but had twinkling blue eyes and a world of stories, having been overseas in the war. Once he brought us a whole bucket of blackberries he'd picked along the railroad track. My mom tried to refuse that big pail as too generous a gift. "Why, don't talk nonsense," Hazel said. "They aren't our berries. The Lord done made these things for us to share." My mother loved to work. For her, a good time was building a stone wall or clearing brush. On occasion, Hazel would come over and sit in a lawn chair under the oaks while Mama stacked stones or split kindling. They would just talk about this and that, Hazel telling about how she liked a good wood pile, especially when she used to take in washing to earn a little extra. She needed a goodly pile to fuel her wash tubs. She had worked as a cook in a place down by the river, and she shook her head at the number of platters she could carry at one time. Mama would tell her about her students and a trip she had taken, and Hazel would wonder at the very idea of flying in an airplane. And Hazel would tell about the time she was called to deliver a baby in a snowstorm, or how people would come to her door for healing herbs. She said how some other lady professor had once come with a tape recorder to talk to her and was going to put her in a book on account of all the old ways she knew. But the professor had never come back, and Hazel had never seen the book. I half listened to talk about gathering hickory nuts under the big trees or carrying a lunch pail to her daddy, who worked making barrels at the distillery down by the river, but my mother was charmed by Hazel's stories. I know my mother loved being a scientist, but she always said that she was born too late. Her real calling, she was sure, was to be a 19th century farm wife. She sang while she canned tomatoes, stewed peaches, punched down the dough for bread, and was insistent that I learn how, too. When I think back on her friendship with Hazel, I suppose that the deep respect they had for each other was rooted in such things. Both were women with feet planted deep in the earth who took pride in a back strong enough to carry a load for others. Mostly I heard their talk as a drone of grown-up chatter. But one time, when my mother was coming across the yard with a big armload of wood, I saw Hazel drop her head in her hands and cry. "When I lived at home," she said, "I could carry a load like that. Why, I could carry a bushel of peaches on one hip and a baby on the other without hardly trying. But now it's all gone, gone with the wind." Hazel was born and raised over in Jessamine County, Kentucky, just down the road. To hear her talk, though, it might have been hundreds of miles away. She couldn't drive, nor could Janie or Sam, so her old house was as lost to her as if it lay across the Great Divide. She had come here to live with Sam when he had a heart attack on Christmas Eve. She loved Christmas, all the folks coming by, cooking a big dinner, but she dropped everything that Christmas, locked her door, and came to live with her son and look after him. She hadn't been back home since, but you could see that her heart ached for the place. She would get a faraway look in her eyes when she spoke of it. My mother understood this, the longing for home. She was a northern girl, born in the shadow of the Adirondacks. She had lived lots of places for graduate school and research, but always thought she'd go back home. I remember the fall she cried for missing the blaze of red maple. She was transplanted to Kentucky by dint of a good job and my father's career, but I know she missed her own folks and the woods of home. The taste of exile was as much in her mouth as it was in Hazel's. As Hazel grew older, she got sadder and would talk more and more about the old times, the things she would never see again, how tall and handsome her husband Rowley had been, how beautiful her gardens were. My mother once offered to take her back to see her old place, but she shook her head. "That's mighty nice of you, but I couldn't be beholden like that. Anyway, it's gone with the wind," she would say, "all gone." But one fall afternoon, when the light was long and gold, she phoned up. "Now, honey, I know your hands and heart are full, but if there was any way you could see fit to drive me back to the old place, I'd be right thankful. I need to see to that roof before the snow flies." My mother and I picked her up and drove her up the Nicholasville Road toward the river. It's all 4-lane now, with a big span across the Kentucky River, so high you hardly know it's flowing, muddy below you. At the old distillery, boarded up and empty now, we left the highway and drove down a little dirt road that angles back away from the river. Hazel began to cry in the back seat the minute we made the turn. "Oh, my dear old road," she cried, and I patted her hand. I knew what to do, for I'd seen my mother cry just like this when she took me past the house where she had grown up. Hazel directed Mama past the ramshackle little houses, a few stove-in trailers, and remnants of barns. We stopped before a grassy swale under a thick grove of black locust trees. "Here it is," she said, "my home sweet home." She talked like that, like it was right out of a book. Before us was an old schoolhouse with long chapel windows set all around and 2 doors at the front, one for boys and one for girls. It was silvery gray with just a few swipes of whitewash blurred across the clapboard. Hazel was eager to get out, and I had to hurry to get her walker to her before she stumbled in the tall grass. Pointing all the way at the spring house, the old chicken coop, she led Mama and me to the side door and up onto the porch. She fumbled in her big purse for the keys, but her hands were shaking so badly she asked me if I would unlock the door. I opened the tattered old screen door and the key slid easily into the padlock. I held the door back for her and she clumped inside and stopped. Just stopped and looked. It was quiet as a church. The air was cold inside and flowed out past me into the warm November afternoon. I started to go in, but my mother's hand on my arm stopped me. "Just let her be," her look said. The room before us was like a picture book about the olden days. A big old wood stove sat along the back wall, cast iron frying pans hung alongside. Dish towels were neatly hung on dowels near the dry sink, and once white curtains framed the view of the grove outside. The ceilings were high, as befits an old schoolhouse, and festooned with garlands of tinsel, blue and silver, flickering in the breeze from the open door. Christmas cards outlined the door frames, fixed with yellowing tape. The whole kitchen was decked out for Christmas. An oilcloth of a holiday print covered the table, and plastic poinsettias swathed in cobwebs set in jam jars as a centerpiece. The table was set for 6 places, and there was still food on the plates. The chairs pushed back just as they were when dinner had been interrupted by the call from the hospital. "What a sight," she said. "Let's put this all to rights." Suddenly Hazel became as businesslike as if she just walked into her house after supper and found it below her housewifely standards. She set her walker aside and began gathering up the dishes from the long kitchen table and carrying them over to the sink. My mother tried to slow her down by asking for a tour of the place and saying we could get to tidying another time. Hazel took us into the parlor where the skeleton of a Christmas tree stood with a pile of needles on the floor below. The ornaments hung like orphans on the bare branches. There was a little red drum and silver plastic birds with paint worn off and stubs where the tails should be. It had been a cozy room. There were rocking chairs and a couch, a little spindle-legged table, and gas lamps. An old oak sideboard held a china pitcher and basin, a china pitcher and basin painted with roses. A hand-embroidered scarf, cross-stitched in pink and blue, ran the length of the sideboard. "My goodness," she said, wiping the corner of her house dress over the thick layer of dust. "I've got to get after my dustin' in here." Hazel leaned on my mother's arm as we circled around the clearing outside, pointing out trees she had planted and flower beds long overgrown. At the back of the house, under the oaks, was a clump of bare gray branches erupting with a froth of stringy yellow blossoms. "Why, looky here, it's my old medicine come to greet me," she said, and reached out to take a branch as if she was going to shake its hand. "I made many a batch of this old witch hazel, and folks would come to me for it special. I'd cook up that bark in the fall and have it all winter to rub on aches and pains, burns and rashes. Everybody wanted it. There ain't hardly no hurt the woods don't have medicine for." "That witch hazel," she said. "It's not just good for you outside, but inside too. Land sakes, flowers in November. The good Lord gave us witch hazel to remind us that there's always something good, even when it seems like there ain't. It just lightens your heavy heart is what it does." After that first visit, Hazel would often call on a Sunday afternoon and ask, "Would you all like to go for a drive?" My mother thought it important that we girls go along. It was like her insistence that we learn to bake bread and plant beans, things that didn't seem important then, but now I know differently. We got to pick hickory nuts from behind the old house, wrinkle our noses at the tilting outhouse, and root around in the barn for treasures while Mama and Hazel sat on the porch and talked. Hung on a nail right beside her door was an old black metal lunchbox, open and lined with what looked like shelf paper. There were remnants of a bird's nest inside. Hazel had brought along a small plastic bag filled with cracker crumbs, which she scattered on the porch rail. "This little Jenny Wren has made her home here every year since Rowley passed on. This here was his lunch pail. Now she counts on me for a house and home. I can't let her down." A lot of people must have counted on Hazel when she was young and strong. She took us driving down her road, and we stopped at nearly every house but one. "Them are no-count folks," she said, and looked away. The others seemed overjoyed to see Hazel again. My sister and I would follow the chickens around or pet the hound dogs while Mama and Hazel would visit with the neighbors. These folks were very different from the ones we met at school or at parties at the college. One lady reached out to tap my teeth. "Those are mighty purty teeth you got," she said. I'd never thought the teeth were worthy of a compliment. But then I hadn't met people before who had so few. I mostly remember their kindness, though. They were ladies Hazel had sung with in the choir of the little white church under the pines, ladies she had known since girlhood, and they cackled together about dances by the river and shook their heads sadly over the fate of kids who up and moved away. We'd go home in the afternoon with a basket of fresh eggs or a slice of cake for each of us, and Hazel just beaming. When winter began, our visits were fewer, and the light seemed to go out of Hazel's eyes. She sat at our kitchen table one day and said, "I know I shouldn't ask the good Lord for nothing more than what I already got, but how I wish I could have just one more Christmas in my dear old home. But those days are gone with the wind." This was an ache for which the woods had no medicine. We were not going north to my grandma and grandpa's for Christmas that year, and my mother was taking it hard. It was still weeks until Christmas, but already she was baking up a fury while we girls strung popcorn and cranberries for the trees. She talked about how she would miss the snow, the smell of balsam, and her family. And then she got an idea. It was to be a complete surprise. She got the house key from Sam and went to the old schoolhouse to see what she could do. She got on the phone to the rural electric co-op and arranged to have Hazel's power reconnected just for a few days. As soon as the lights came on, it became clear how dirty it all was. There was no running water, so we had to bring jugs of water from home to sponge things down. The job was bigger than us, so Mama enlisted the help of some fraternity boys from her classes at the college who needed a community service project. They sure got one. Cleaning out that refrigerator rivaled any microbiology experiment. We drove up and down Hazel's Road where I ran into houses with handmade invitations for all her old friends. There weren't too many, so Mama invited the college boys and her friends too. The house still had its Christmas decorations, but we made more, paper chains and candles out of paper towel tubes. My dad cut a tree and set it up in the parlor with a box of lights stripped from the skeleton tree that had stood there before. We brought armloads of prickly red cedar boughs to decorate the tables and hung candy canes on the tree. The smell of cedar and peppermint filled the place where mold and mice had been only days ago. My mom and her friends baked plates of cookies. The morning of the party, the heat was on, tree lights lit, and one by one people started to arrive, clumping up the steps of the front porch. My sister and I played hostess while Mama drove off to get the guests of honor. "Hey, any of you feel like going for a ride?" Mama said, and bundled Hazel into her warm coat. "Why, where are we going?" Hazel asked. Her face gleamed like a candle when she stepped into her home sweet home, filled with light and friends. My mother pinned a Christmas corsage, a plastic bell with gold glitter that she had found on the dresser, to Hazel's dress. Hazel moved through her house like a queen that day. My father and my sister played their violins in the parlor, Silent Night and Joy to the World, while I ladled out sweet red punch. I don't remember much more about the party except Hazel falling asleep on the way home. Just a few years later, we left Kentucky to move back north. My mom was glad to be going home to have her maples instead of oaks, but saying goodbye to Hazel was hard. She saved it for last. Hazel gave her a going-away present, a rocking chair, and a little box with a couple of her old-time Christmas ornaments inside, a celluloid drum and a silver plastic bird missing its tail feathers. My mother still hangs them on her Christmas tree every year and tells the story of that party as if it were the best Christmas she ever had. We got word that Hazel had died a couple of years after we moved. "Gone, all gone with the wind," she would have said. There are some aches which Hazel can't assuage. For those, we need each other. My mother and Hazel Barnett, unlikely sisters, I suppose, learned well from the plants they both loved. They made a balm for loneliness together, a strengthening tea for the pain of longing. Now when the red leaves are all down and the geese are gone, I go looking for witch hazel. It never lets me down, always carrying the memory of that Christmas and how their friendship was medicine for each other. I cherish a witch hazel kind of day, a scrap of color, a light in the window when winter is closing all around. I wanted to mention that on February 7th, there'll be a discussion at the library of this book, and the facilitator will be Laura Ogden, who's a Strafford neighbor and also an anthropologist, teaches at Dartmouth. And I think it's a wonderful occasion to gather to talk about something as old-fashioned as a book, sort of like a reminder. And she doesn't mind at all if you have heard the parts that we've read here, if you hadn't had time to read the whole book. It's going to be a discussion that explores not just the book in a kind of scholarly way, but people's responses to it. we have an offering basket in the back. We also have a special basket for Hearts to Hold, and this is an opportunity as well when we gather for refreshments if you have questions for Eloise about that project. You can also give online, of course. So thank you for your presence, for the generosity of your care and concentration. We invite you to bring the thoughtfulness of this gathering into the coming days. And now the choir is going to help us sing For the Beauty of the Earth, and we'll do verses 1 to 4. This is in the Methodist hymnal number 92. Let's conclude our time together in quiet reflection.
because of the readings we've been doing, we wanted to end singing together. So it's, if you don't know the words, it's in your same hymnal, number 667, Shalom Paparim, and I think most of you know it. We'll sing it once through, and then we'll go in 3 groups. So this is going to be 1 with us, then that's going to be 2, and you're going to lead number 3, and then Jim, you can join the 3 as well. I will sing it like 3 times through, and I just wanted to sing that under the shower, in your car, while you do groceries. Just keep that in mind. And so basically, we're teaching you a song that you will, know already maybe, but it's Shalom Paparim, and it is a Hebrew thing. So it's basically have peace, farewell, dear friends, stay safe. It's a free translation, but it's basically that you are a community and that we all want peace for each other. So that is basically what the message that you wanted to give you when you go home. So the first one's through. Shalom Havarim, Shalom Havarim, Shalom, Shalom.